Darkcast Network, indie pods with a dark side. This week, I'm going to get into a case that was requested by two of my friends, a husband and wife. Hey, guys. They don't want me to say their name, so I won't. It was one of their relatives. So I've been researching this case for a while. I was supposed to put this episode out a bit ago, but the holidays had me really lazy. I did jack shit during my vacation, quite frankly. So when I was researching it prior, there wasn't really a lot of information out there other than some court documents. And then today, as I was wrapping up and getting ready to record, I wanted to confirm something, so I did a Google search, and all of a sudden, this case is all over Google. So I didn't know that this was going to be a thing, but there's now an episode out as of yesterday on Investigation Discovery's American Monster. I watched it right before I recorded. I'm not going to talk about it. I don't really know how I feel about it. That's all I'm going to say. So today I'm going to be talking about the murder of Tamela Gardner. So Tamela Tammy Jean Gardner was born on July 16, 1965 to parents Martin and Lillian Creer. She was a lifelong resident of Wilmington, Delaware. She had a ton of friends and family in the area. Tammy married a man by the name of Scott Gardner in her early 20s, and they went on to have two children of their own. After the birth of her first child, which is her daughter, she decided to open up her own daycare. Tammy's TLC home daycare and tutor time was really successful. She had a good reputation, she was loving and caring, and people really trusted her with their children. Once Tammy and Scott's relationship had severed, she ended up getting into a relationship with a man named Clifford Wright, and I'm going to be talking about him a bit briefly. So Clifford was born January 12th, 1970, and unlike Tammy, Clifford had a long history of violence, with his criminal record beginning in 1988 when he was only 18 years old. Clifford hit the ground running and just started right out the gate with felony car theft. He was arrested for theft again in 1989. In 1990, he was convicted of financial card fraud. At one point, he impersonated his brother during a routine traffic stop, and he did this to avoid being charged for driving without a license and driving without insurance. He was charged in 2003 for burglary in the second degree after he burglarized his brother's home, stealing jewelry that belonged to not only his sister-in-law, but his mother. And he went to jail for that for a year. In the fall of 2003, Tammy met Clifford at Tailgates Bar, which is located in Newark, Delaware. This is about 15 to 20 minutes away from Wilmington. And shortly after meeting, Clifford moved into Tammy's home along with her children. Not too long after moving in, this is when Clifford committed that burglary that I had mentioned previously, and he wasn't released until May of 2005. But Tammy allowed Clifford to move back in after he finished serving his sentence. Tammy and Clifford's relationship was toxic. Clifford was physically, emotionally, and verbally abusive towards Tammy, and he often did this in front of her children as well. During the course of their relationship, Tammy did end their relationship multiple times, but ultimately ended up going back to Clifford when he would ask for her forgiveness. However, on Saturday, July 1st of 2006, they got into a large altercation, which caused Tammy to leave for good. Tammy had already had plans to attend a pool party later that day with her children, and she asked Clifford to make sure that he had his belongings out of the home by the time they returned later that evening. Clifford obviously did not respect Tammy's request, and according to one of Clifford's friends, Raheem, who we're going to be discussing later, Clifford told him that instead he went to that pool party to watch Tammy and see what she was doing. Beginning at 7:14 that same evening, Clifford began to call Tammy in an effort to win her back, but he did this by repeatedly calling her 35 times between 7:14 to 2:31 in the morning. Once Clifford realized that Tammy was ignoring him, he decided to go sleep at his friend Raheem's house. The following day, which is now Sunday, July 2nd, Clifford began calling Tammy again and again, calling her 25 times between 7:34 in the morning and 9:28 at night. This obviously made Tammy feel uneasy, so she made the decision to bag up Clifford's belongings herself and then leave them on her porch for him to pick up. Tammy's daughter later testified at trial that this was the first time that she ever saw her mother pack up his belongings, so this was indicative of the fact that she was actually done this time. On Monday, July 3rd, Clifford called Tammy 32 times. The following day, which was Tuesday the 4th, Tammy took her children to a barbecue. That day, Clifford had asked Tammy if he could borrow a motorcycle that she recently purchased, and she agreed. He brought the bike back around 7:30. About a half hour later, Clifford returned to the area with a friend in a vehicle, and as they drove by, he screamed out of the window, quote, "fucking crack whore." His friend that was with him later testified during trial that Clifford believed that Tammy was inside with another man. Tammy did meet a man named Gabriel Gabrielli, who was a father of 5 at that barbecue, but I couldn't find any evidence that they actually hung out at her place that day. The only thing that I could find that was confirmed in court documents was that they ended up meeting for dinner and drinks the following day. On the 5th, Clifford went to Tammy's house to grab a bottle of cologne he left behind. Tammy wanted to leave it outside, but Clifford really pushed Tammy to see her, so she agreed to briefly chat with him in the driveway. During this conversation, Tammy told Clifford that she intended to completely sever all ties with him, which obviously angered Clifford. Clifford ended up stalking Tammy at Good Shop Bar that night later in Wilmington. He sat in the parking lot and watched Tammy inside with her friend Gabriel, where they hung out over a span of 3 hours. This made Clifford even more angry, so he then decided to call Newcastle County Police Department and report that there were drug sales going on inside of the bar in an effort to try to get them both in trouble. He then called Scott Gardner, Tammy's ex-husband, and told him that Tammy was an unfit mother and that she used drugs. Then, in an effort to lure Tammy and Gabriel out of the bar, Clifford called Tammy 43 times and left threatening voicemails along with pleading voicemails for her forgiveness. In one of the voicemails, Clifford said, quote, "You done played with the wrong person, little lady. You got me mean." Tammy contacted her ex-husband, who told her to call the police, and so she did. They arrived shortly after 3:30 in the morning, and they arrested Clifford for aggravated harassment. Before I continue, I've talked about this before, but I just want to again shed some light on some domestic violence facts. So, according to some national domestic violence statistics, which I'll link in the show notes, nearly half of all female homicide victims, so almost half of the women that are murdered, are killed by a current or former male intimate partner. And the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is when she or he leaves the relationship. So this is the most dangerous time for Tammy right now. And Clifford is fucking pissed. Clifford was released at 6 a.m. the following morning, Thursday, July 6th. He was in custody for less than 3 hours, and he immediately went to Tammy's home and waited for Scott to leave the children at Tammy's. He then approached Scott and told him that Tammy was unfit, she used drugs, and pleaded with him to take custody of the children. Tammy took her children later that evening to Crossroads Diner, and as they were eating, they had noticed that Clifford's car had driven by a few times, and this ended up scaring not only Tammy, but her children as well. So she called her ex-husband, Scott, and asked if he could take the children because she feared for their safety around Clifford. Friday, July 7th, Clifford called Tammy's employer. At this point, she no longer had the daycare, so he identified himself by his middle name and told her supervisor that Tammy was using drugs. Her supervisor ended up calling her and talking to her about the phone call, which left Tammy hysterical. She explained the situation to her supervisor, and she told her supervisor that she was afraid that something really bad was going to happen to her. On Saturday, July 8th, her 2 children left to go stay with their father. Tammy asked a neighbor to watch the home and be on the lookout for Clifford and let them know that if they see him, to please notify the police. Later that evening, Tammy met Gabriel and another friend that I'm going to keep anonymous at the Good Shop Bar. The 3 returned to Tammy's home after, and the friend ended up eventually leaving the home around 1:30 a.m. Gabriel stayed. This would be the last time that Tammy and Gabriel were seen alive. Now I want to get into some things about Clifford's past. This is going to be violent and there's going to be sexual assault, so just keep that in mind as you listen. Clifford spent that night drinking at Tailgate's bar. So this timeline and the exact details aren't exactly clear. I'm going to get into more of it in the appeal when I talk about Raheem, his friend that he's now staying with. But according to Newcastle County Police Department, Clifford stated to them that he left Tailgate's bar around 1:45 in the morning and then went to Raheem's home, which again is where he was staying. And he stated that he arrived there around 2:10 a.m. That timeline does make sense just for the commuting time. Tailgates is in Newark, which is about 15 to 20 minutes away from Wilmington. But what doesn't make sense is everything else. Clifford's phone records and Raheem's testimony. They both directly contradict Clifford's account. Specifically, Clifford's phone shows him traveling away from Raheem's home and towards Tammy's home. Additionally, according to Raheem, Clifford called him when he was still at the bar and asked him to pick up a pack of cigarettes. So Raheem did that. He grabbed him a pack and he left it on his pillow. And according to Raheem, Clifford never returned home that night. Court documents state that Clifford likely gained entrance into Tammy's home through a basement window cover that he left unlocked after he finished cleaning it when he still lived there. Police did later find a 9-inch cut on one of the basement window screens, so this is likely the scenario. However, he did also have a old garage key that was never recovered, or a remote rather, and there was also an upstairs window that didn't lock, but it's likely that the basement window was the point of entry. So he gained entry through one of these points, snuck up to the upstairs bedroom where Tammy and Gabriel slept, and he beat them with a blunt object, likely a bat or a hammer. Assistant medical examiner to the state, Dr. Jenny Vershopsky, testified during trial that Gabriel had at least 11 injuries to his head and Tammy had at least 8. She further stated that neither had defensive wounds, so it was likely that they did not gain consciousness before they died and they just died in their sleep. After the murders, Clifford tried to clean the room using window cleaner, a scrub brush, and a vacuum cleaner. He used bleach to remove stains on the carpet, the bed, the walls, and a mirror. He changed the sheets on Tammy's bed with fresh linens that he grabbed from an adjacent bedroom, and he discarded the bloody sheets into garbage bags. Clifford then removed bloody portions of the mattress and filled the holes with foam egg crate. Clifford dragged the bodies downstairs along with the garbage bags filled with bloody linens and placed them into Tammy's van along with a gas can. Tammy's van had the back seat out of it at this point in time, so he was able to fit everything, including the bodies, in there without an issue. Clifford then drove to Tweed Park and attempted to set the van on fire. Clifford brought Tammy's daughter's bicycle with him, which he used to ride back. 4 days later, on July 13th, Tammy's partially burned van was discovered by construction workers in the park, who then notified Newcastle County Police Department. Within the van, police found the 2 bodies, the gas can, cleaning supplies, and the sheets. The bodies were badly burned, but the fire extinguished itself due to the lack of air. Now, prior to the bodies being discovered, Clifford participated in a voluntary interview regarding the whereabouts of Tammy, because at this point, Tammy's family, nobody had any idea where she was. At this point, Tammy was gone, her van was gone, and while it was unclear exactly what happened, there were still some lingering bloodstains in the bedroom. So now Clifford is at this voluntary interview and he admits to delivering cocaine. And he ended up being charged with 2 counts of delivery of cocaine. And I'm going to elaborate on these 2 charges in a bit. While Clifford was incarcerated on these charges, the Department of Justice indicted him for the murders of Tammy and Gabriel on January 22nd, 2008. I wanted to tell the story briefly of what happened to Tammy and Gabriel, and I wanted to pause before I get into the trial and backtrack a bit and talk about Clifford's relationship history, because I think that it shows not only a pattern, but also provides very strong evidence that Clifford was escalating in his violence towards women. In 1999, Clifford married a woman with a daughter. Clifford abused not only his wife, but his stepdaughter as well. When his stepdaughter was 15, he sexually assaulted her using a screwdriver and a hairbrush. After his wife ended the relationship, he continuously harassed and threatened her. Clifford met his first girlfriend following his separation from his first wife at Tailgate's Bar in the fall of 2001. I said first wife. He only had one. Sorry, guys. Clifford moved into her home along with her 2 children, but she quickly became fearful when she heard very aggressive phone calls Clifford was making to his estranged wife, and this ended up causing her to end the relationship. She asked Clifford to leave, and he ended up breaking into her home. She then called the police on him, which prompted Clifford to block her car into a parking lot of a bar shortly after. A no-contact order was then issued against Clifford, but he broke it repeatedly, calling her and harassing her incessantly. He then lied to police and accused her of breaking the no-contact order, which resulted in him getting arrested for harassment and criminal contempt. Clifford met his second girlfriend at Tailgate's Bar and moved in with her as well as her children in March of 2002. On one occasion, when the girlfriend was out at a banquet hall along with some friends, Clifford showed up and demanded she returned home immediately, demonstrating scary, possessive, and jealous behavior. She left, and when she got back, she asked for her keys back. Not long after this, Clifford was in a work release program, and she decided to pay him a visit here to make sure that he was sure that the relationship was over. The fence separating Clifford and his now ex-girlfriend did not matter to him. Upon hearing the news, he decided to try to scale the fence, ripping his clothes open, telling her that he had 2 guns and that he wasn't afraid to use them. Once he was released from the work release program, he broke into her home with a key that he had made without her knowing. She was thankfully able to hide in her daughter's room safely and call the police. Again, Clifford was handed a no contact order. Clifford met girlfriend 3 at tailgates and moved in with her and her children in March of 2003. After Clifford saw her getting into a truck with another man, Clifford chased them down. When he got to them, he grabbed her by the shirt and forced her into his vehicle. When they returned home, he became physically violent. This caused her to end the relationship, and again, Clifford harassed and stalked her. A third no-contact order was issued. In the summer of 2003, girlfriend 2 took him back, but he did not attend his court-ordered domestic violence counseling. He became violent again, and she ended the relationship for good. It was the following fall, the fall of 2003, where Clifford met Tammy. Now again, January 22nd, 2008, Clifford was indicted by a grand jury. The state of Delaware requested the death penalty, and his trial began on October 5th of 2009. The state had 2 key witnesses during trial. The first was Robert Mahan, who shared a cell with Clifford for 5 days at the Howard R. Young Correctional Institute. The second was Dr. Jenny Vershovsky. She was the assistant medical examiner for the Delaware office of the chief medical examiner. While sharing a cell, Clifford told Robert many important pieces of information that indicated that Clifford knew intimate details of the crime, mainly regarding the weapon used. Clifford told Robert that Detective Abram, who was the detective on the case, was, quote, making mistakes in the investigation, and that Detective Abram thought that the weapon used was a hammer, but I used a bat, end quote. Detective Abram did at one point think that it was a hammer. As I had mentioned previously, they weren't entirely sure, but something important to note, because this is something that Clifford argues throughout his appeals process, is that the indictment is all-encompassing. It specifically mentions a blunt weapon and says that it could be a hammer, a crowbar, a bat. So it doesn't specifically say that it is a bat or it is a hammer. Rather, it says that it's a blunt weapon and it could be any of the above. On November 19th, 2009, Clifford Wright was found guilty of the following charges. So these first 2 counts are specific to Tammy. Count 1 is murder in the first degree, and count 2 is possession of a deadly weapon during the commission of a felony. Counts 3 and 4 are the same as 1 and 2, but these are specific to Gabriel. Counts 5, 6, 7, and 8 are the same counts repeated as counts 1 through 4. So he's charged twice for murder in the first degree and possession of a deadly weapon for each person, Tammy and Gabriel. Count 9 is first-degree burglary, 10 is noncompliance with bond conditions, 11 is, again, possession of a deadly weapon during the commission of a felony, 12 is theft of a motor vehicle for her van, 13 is arson in the third degree, and 14 is aggravated harassment. The jury's decision was unanimous and found 4 statutory aggravating and mitigating factors. So if you listened to the murder of Joanne Brenton as well as her son, I talk about this in that trial in terms of aggravating and mitigating factors. So you have factors of, the homicide might be committed in a cruel and unusual fashion, but a mitigating factor might be that somebody had a really difficult childhood. So this is what they're trying to balance here. And these are what people use in order to determine the death penalty or not. Or rather, if the death penalty is just under the circumstances. But in this instance, 5 of the jurors found that aggravating factors did not outweigh the mitigating factors, and 7 found that the aggravating factors did outweigh them. So ultimately, this took the death penalty off the table. And on March 5th, 2010, he was sentenced to 4 life sentences plus 137 additional years. I'm going to go back and talk about the 2 counts of delivery of cocaine charges that Clifford got in 2008 because he did make an appeal against this. It was affirmed, so it's irrelevant, but it gives more insight into Clifford's movements that night prior to the murder. So the way that they were able to determine that Clifford was involved in this is that his friend Raheem was arrested and charged with possession with intent to deliver cocaine and other related drug charges in June of 2006. On July 13th, Detective Thomas Abram called Rahim after he had that voluntary interview with Clifford the previous day, and he wanted to question him about an incident that involved both himself and Clifford. So Detective Abram assured him that he wouldn't be prosecuted for any statements that he made. So then he began to confess these details that the detectives used against Clifford. Rahim told Detective Abram that he sold cocaine to Clifford twice in two different incidences on the night of July 8th. Clifford was roommates with Rahim again briefly after he was kicked out of Tammy's, and according to Rahim, Clifford regularly purchased cocaine from him at least twice a month over the span of a year, and that's how they knew each other. Rahim admitted that while he used weed himself, he didn't use cocaine, he had just sold it for 2 years on a daily basis. On the 8th, Rahim was having a slow night dealing, so he decided to go to a friend's house that was having some people over. Rahim called Clifford to see if he was looking to grab some cocaine, and a few minutes later, Clifford returned his call. At first, he wanted just over 1.5 grams, so Rahim bagged it up and he went to meet Clifford at his favorite hangout spot, Tailgate's Bar. Clifford spent $100, but later called Rahim back for more, but this time there was another individual with Clifford, and Rahim had no idea who this person was. So at that point, he assumed that he was getting this second bag of cocaine from Clifford to give to his friend. So once Detective Abram questioned Clifford about Rahim's specific statements, it was then that he admitted to purchasing and delivering the 2 bundles of cocaine to another individual on the night of the 8th. And he absolutely insisted that the bags weren't for him because he didn't do cocaine. So Clifford was arrested and charged, and Rahim received immunity in exchange for his testimony for the prosecution during Clifford's trial. Clifford's counsel objected prior to the state introducing any of this evidence, and they moved for dismissal due to the state's alleged failure to establish corpus delicti, which means the body of the crime. And basically, what they're trying to establish is that there's no real way that the state or anybody can prove that the substance that were in those baggies that Clifford bought and allegedly sold was in fact cocaine. And so therefore, you are not proving that it actually was cocaine, thus the crime actually happened. This motion was denied, so his counsel moved for judgment of acquittal due to the state's alleged failure to present sufficient evidence that would allow a rational jury to then conclude that the substance in question was cocaine. This was also denied, and this resulted in Clifford filing an appeal, which again was denied. On November 23, 2009, Clifford filed a motion for a new trial, asserting that during rebuttal, the state mischaracterized Robert's testimony, this was his previous roommate, misstated facts, and used the rebuttal to make an argument that the state had not previously asserted. Delaware Supreme Court remanded Clifford's case to the Superior Court to rule on this, and on July 30th, 2010, the Superior Court denied Clifford's motion for a new trial. Clifford had made appeals to Delaware Supreme Court, but they affirmed his conviction. And on August 23, 2012, Clifford filed a motion requesting for the appointment of counsel. This was granted by the Superior Court, and he was appointed counsel on October 17, 2012. On October 18, 2012, Clifford filed a pro se, which means in one's own behalf, motion for post-conviction relief, and this was pursuant to Delaware Superior Court Rule 61, and he raised 5 issues. Delaware Superior Court Rule 61 is called post-conviction remedy, and this lays out the procedure that an individual has to go through when they're seeking to set aside their conviction. Now, when Clifford initially filed this motion pro se on his own behalf, he raised 5 issues. However, he was appointed counsel, as I mentioned previously. So on August 1st of 2015, Clifford's appointed counsel filed an amended motion raising only 1 issue. So they only used 1 out of the 5 that he raised initially. During that, the one ground that they raised for post-conviction relief under this rule was that trial counsel was ineffective and they failed to investigate and present any evidence or testimony to rebut the testimony of Dr. Vershovsky and Robert. So this rule essentially means that ineffective counsel at trial and on direct appeal are valid in motions for post-conviction relief. This standard was set in a 1984 Supreme Court case, Strickland versus Washington, which established a 2-pronged test to determine ineffective counsel. So petitioners must show 1, that, quote, counsel's representation fell below an objective standard of reasonableness, and 2, that, quote, there is a reasonable probability that but for the counsel's unprofessional errors, the result of the proceeding would have been different, end quote. So basically that means that If his counsel was ineffective to a manner that would have impacted the verdict, meaning if they did a better job, he might have been found not guilty, then that would apply and he would be able to fight that based on that rule. Now, Clifford believed that his counsel was ineffective because they didn't investigate or present evidence or testimony that could rebut the testimony that was given by both Robert and Dr. Vershovsky. Clifford believed that the defense should have gotten the opinion of an expert in forensic pathology and that this could have been used to cross-examine Dr. Vershovsky and rebut Robert's testimony regarding the alleged murder weapon. In his motion, Clifford stated that a bat could have been ruled out as the murder weapon, which would then make Robert's testimony seem not credible. The motion states, quote, "Trial counsel's failure in this regard was significant. Mr. Wright needed a forensic pathologist to review Dr. Vershovsky's findings and to rebut Mahan's claim that a bat had been used to murder Ms. Gardner and Mr. Gabrielli. Had trial counsel's expert ruled out the possibility that a bat was used, as Vershovsky would not, it would have established that Mahan, a man in an unenviable situation given his condition at the time, lied. A lie would have called into question the remainder of Mahan's testimony, which was already questionable. A forensic pathologist ruling out a bat would have provided meaningful rebuttal to the state's arguments regarding Mr. Wright's supposed admissions to Mahan. Instead, trial counsel failed to hire an expert and as a result was ineffective. Trial counsel was totally unprepared to confront Mahan's statement. It missed out on the opportunity to rule out the use of a bat due to the diameter of the injuries and to discuss the amount of force necessary to use the handle of a bat to cause the injuries in this case, as the state suggested, was possible on redirect. The mechanics of swinging a hammer differ greatly from poking someone with the handle of a baseball bat, and thus the force generated will vary. Either way, trial counsel's mistake allowed the state to tie its circumstantial case together with a confession and therefore prejudiced Mr. Wright. Ultimately, the court found that Clifford did not establish a claim for ineffective assistance of counsel under Strickland based on the two-pronged test I mentioned previously. Therefore, his amended motion for post-conviction relief was denied, and this was decided on February 12, 2015. Clifford filed his second motion for post-conviction relief on July 15, 2016, citing the same 5 issues he mentioned in his previous filing, and additionally, that his post-conviction counsel was ineffective due to the fact that they failed to raise all of the 5 issues he mentioned in his pro se filing. This was denied in November of 2016. Clifford filed an appeal after he received his second denial in November of 2016, and this was submitted on March 10, 2017. This was denied on May 12, 2017, and ultimately the November 2016 decision was upheld. Today, Clifford Wright is an inmate at the Delaware Department of Corrections in Dover, Delaware, where he will spend the rest of his life in prison. And that was the murder of Tamela Gardner and Gabriel Gabrielli.